But first, we turn to one of the hottest young authors in the country today. Junot Diaz was born in the Dominican Republic and came to this country when he was 7 years old, not knowing a word of English. In 1996, at the age of 26, he became a literary star with the publication of Drown, a collection of spare but powerful short stories. 11 years later, Diaz has published his second book, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. This novel, which has already won wide critical and popular acclaim, tells a tragic comic story of the lovesick, overweight nerd, Oscar de Leon, and of his family, torn from their home and their past glories in the Dominican Republic by the brutal regime of Rafael Trujillo. I spoke with Junot Diaz at his agent's office in Manhattan. Junot, you published your book of short stories, Drown, back in 1996. Now, you just published your first novel, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, last September. Why this 11-year gap?
The truth is I have no idea. But probably a more useful answer is comes in a number of parts. I'm slow. It was a very difficult book. And there was two other books that I was trying to write that kind of dive bombed. They just collapsed on me. So I've 11 years and thousands of pages to show for it, but only one book.
How did that breakthrough come? How did Oscar come into your life?
Oh, Oscar was sort of an accident. It was he was just a side job. I was trying to write this novel about the destruction of New York City and its aftermath 20 years later. And I was having a terrible time with it. I couldn't really get my mind wrapped around it. This was in around 1998, 99, and 2000. And then one day I was living in Mexico City and I was at a party and this character just sprang to my mind completely, almost full. I mean, just him, who he was, his family, his relationships, it just jumped into my head. And I didn't think nothing of it. I started writing it, and then I said, you know what, this is distracting me from my real novel, which was hilarious because that was my real novel. But in my mind, I was so willful and so prideful that I couldn't acknowledge a gift when I saw one. I was so busy trying to be controlling and be the person who, I wanted to be the person who ran the train instead of realizing that you're just in the caboose,
Now, what did you learn about writing in writing The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde?
You can't say it enough. What I learned is that I didn't know jack, and that.
Well, I think the readers of Drown would differ with you about that.
Oh, they're very nice, but I think it's an incredibly difficult process. I think that every time you jump into that tank, there's a new shark in there. But to be answered more directly, probably more frankly, you have to discover and you rediscover, you relearn, is that if you don't trust your unconscious, if you don't trust your story, if you're always trying to do your story instead of the story that's coming to you, you're going to have a lot of problems.
How do you tell the difference when you're doing your thing instead of letting it do its own thing?
Control. When you're controlling. When you're going through life with both feet on the brakes. It's hard to describe it to another person. There's a difference when you're in a moment and you're really in a moment and open and sort of free to the experience, and versus when you're in a moment and you're trying to mediate it through your intelligence, through your aloofness, through your control. You're creating a barrier between you and what's happening. Yeah. And I think the same sort of insight that you have, that experiential instance, is occurring in the pages. I mean, every time that I wasn't playing, literally just playing, I knew that there was a problem. Yeah. When I really thought that I was in control, bad move, very bad move. But it's nothing that you learn forever. I'm going to have to relearn that lesson.
That was my question. So you're probably going to do the same thing again.
Well, you relearn it. We can't help it. I mean, part of the hubris of being human is the thought that our brains will give us a hedge against the world, but it's not true. The world is random in ways that our brains and our subjectivities can never control. And I think that, we have to keep fighting our desire to be in control of this universe with the awareness or the realization that, in fact, we're in the driver's seat. I mean, we're in the passenger seat barely. Usually we're just tied up in the trunk and something else is driving completely. But we like to pretend we're the driver.
Yeah. Now, you also said that you had to learn to be more compassionate in your writing. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, again, it's like it's worth thinking about. I mean, when people write characters, usually your success in writing characters, you can define it in a couple ways. You could say it's because of your craft, your control of your craft. You know, I have enough craft, I can sketch a really wonderful character. What I discovered was that your craft can never increase larger than your humanity. I discovered that the smaller my humanity was, that was as big as my characters would get. What I had to do was learn how to be a better person. And it was only only by growing internally in some sort of weird, some mystical way was I able to grasp some of the texture of the human experience that I needed to grasp. But it sounds corny, but it was, for me, it felt very true.
Well, it doesn't sound corny, and in fact, again, I hope you don't think that I'm just flattering you, but I am not alone in saying that in this book and in Drown, one of the things that comes across more than anything is compassion, is the understated empathy that you feel for the characters. There's love there.
Yeah, it's a process, though. I mean, I wish I could say it's like a naturally occurring element, but this is something that has to be manufactured in the smithy of self. I mean, I find myself struggling with that. I think that when I write and what I write is my best self. That's when I'm like, at least approximate the human. The rest of the time, I'm just like a fallen mortal like the rest of us. Yeah. But when I write, I come very, very close to being that kind of numinous dream, that numinous dream of a true human self. I mean,
you've written that you discovered that your mother was a real person when you first learned as an adult that she had lost her first child. Suddenly you saw her as a person with a real world inside her, not the person who cooked your meals or washed your underwear. In Oscar Wilde, we have that kind of same sense when we begin to learn about Belly. At the beginning, we kind of look at her through Oscar and Lola's eyes as a very stern mother. As the story begins to develop, we begin to understand that, yeah, she's a real person. She's somebody with a world inside of her. Was this your intention?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always loved that idea of the kind of the Wizard of Oz, that at the front you get this mask, this kind of like, sensational thing, but if you push beyond the mask, there's like a real thing there, a real person, like a little gnarled body in some ways, something vulnerable. It's sort of important to think about that in some ways, most of us have no access to our parents' real histories. Most of what our parents sell their kids is to protect them. At least in my world, my parents didn't sing no songs about anything that happened to them. And there's this saying that like you only become an adult when you inherit your parents' secrets. And there was this sense in me that the person who gets humanized in this book, the way I became humanized by really understanding, coming to grips with my mother, is in some ways the reader. None of the real characters in the book, have as much access to all the information as the readers do. And the only person who can put this family together in a way that makes sense is the reader. Whoever reads this book, right. You and you're saying, read this, and maybe it will help you become more human. Wow. It helped me. That's in some ways what he's saying.